I have always believed that gardens tell you something about the person who made them. Not in the vague way that people say things like your home reflects your personality, but in a specific and literal way. The choices a gardener makes, what they plant and where, what they protect and what they let go, how they respond when something is damaged or lost, those choices are a kind of autobiography written in soil and root and stone. They tell you what the person values, how they handle setbacks, and what kind of patience they are capable of. My garden told anyone who was paying attention that I was patient, precise, and not someone who forgot damage done to things I had built with care. The damage was done on a Thursday in October. I know it was a Thursday because I was at work when it happened, and Thursdays are the days I work the late shift, which meant I did not come home until 8 in the evening and found what had been done in the diminishing light of an autumn dusk. The front garden of my house on Westhaven Drive had taken me 4 years to build, not 4 years of occasional weekend work, 4 years of considered, systematic, informed effort. I had researched the soil conditions. I had amended them over 2 seasons before planting anything significant. I had selected plants for their compatibility with each other and with the specific microclimate of my south-facing front slope, which received full morning sun and partial afternoon shade, and had a drainage pattern that created distinct wet and dry zones. I had installed a drip irrigation system that I had calibrated myself after 2 seasons of observation. I had placed 3 significant specimen plants, a Japanese maple that I had grown from a 5-gallon container to a 12-foot structured canopy over 4 years, a weeping blue Atlas cedar that I had trained to a specific arching form, and a mature flowering cherry that I had moved from a nursery as a bald and burlapped specimen at considerable expense, and had established over 2 careful seasons. The Japanese maple was cut down, not pruned, cut down. At the base, with something that left a clean cut, a saw or loppers of significant size, the trunk was gone. The root flare remained in the ground with the cut stump above it, the beautiful layered canopy that had taken 4 years to develop gone. The weeping blue Atlas cedar had been cut back to approximately 18 inches of its trained form. The arching branches I had spent 3 years developing were gone. What remained was a stub. The flowering cherry had been dug out. The hole where its root ball had been was still open, raw soil around the edges, some root material visible where the digging had not been clean. The understory planting, the carefully selected combination of ground cover and perennial plantings that I had developed to complement the specimen trees, had been partially destroyed. Some of it by whatever equipment had been used to remove the cherry. Some of it appeared to have been pulled out by hand or with tools. I stood in my front garden in the autumn dusk and looked at what had been done to it. I did not call anyone that evening. I did not file any reports. I went inside and made dinner and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what I was looking at and what I was going to do about it. I had a very good idea who had done it. My name is Ellen Park. I am 46 years old and I have owned the house on Westhaven Drive for 8 years. The house is a craftsman bungalow on a slightly elevated lot that gives the front garden a gentle slope toward the street, which is what created the interesting microclimate I had spent 4 years learning and planting. It is a good house on a good street, and I had been happy there for 8 years, with one exception. The exception was Barbara Crane. Barbara had been on Westhaven Drive for 11 years, which meant she had been there 3 years before I arrived. She was the kind of person who had been somewhere long enough to feel proprietary about it and who had difficulty adjusting when new people arrived with different ideas about how things should look. She was not the HOA president. She was the Landscaping Standards Subcommittee chair, which was a more specific and in some ways more dangerous position because it gave her authority over a specific domain that she had been exercising for 7 years without significant challenge. The Landscaping Standards Subcommittee chair had the authority, under the HOA's governing documents, to issue notices for landscaping that did not meet community standards, to conduct inspections, and to recommend to the full HOA board that violations be escalated to formal enforcement if not corrected. She did not have the authority to take any direct action on a homeowner's property. She could issue notices. She could recommend. She could not touch anyone's plants. The subcommittee governing documents were explicit on this point. I had read them because in year 2 of building my garden, Barbara had begun a campaign of notices that had required me to become familiar with exactly what she was and was not permitted to do. The first notice had been about the Japanese maple. She had alleged that its anticipated mature height would exceed the maximum height permitted for front yard plantings under the landscaping standards. I had researched the variety I had planted. Its mature height at the form I was training it to was within the permitted range. I had responded with documentation. The notice had been withdrawn after the full HOA board reviewed it. The second notice had been about the weeping cedar. She had alleged that its form, specifically the trained arching structure I was developing, was not consistent with the standards for plant form in front yards. The standards document said plants should be maintained in a form consistent with their natural growth habit. A weeping blue Atlas cedar naturally develops a weeping form. I was training it in its natural direction. I responded with documentation, including photographs and the botanical description of the species. The notice was withdrawn. Over 4 years, Barbara had issued me 8 notices. 6 had been withdrawn after my responses. 2 had gone to the full board and been dismissed. Every single one had been about plants I had chosen carefully and installed correctly. Every single one had been about my front garden specifically. The subcommittee chair for 8 years with authority over landscaping standards. 8 notices in 4 years to 1 homeowner, all dismissed. Then on a Thursday in October, the Japanese maple was cut down at the base. I photographed everything Friday morning before I touched anything, every aspect of the damage, close and distant, with my phone camera set to capture location and timestamp data. I photographed the cut stump of the maple at multiple angles. I photographed the cedar stub. I photographed the empty hole where the cherry had been. I photographed the damaged understory. I photographed the soil disturbance and the marks of tools and equipment. I did this methodically for 45 minutes. Then I called my neighbor across the street, a man named Robert Kim, who had been on Westhaven Drive for 15 years and who I trusted to tell me what he knew without embellishment or speculation. Robert came over, he looked at the damage. He said, "Ellen, I saw something Thursday afternoon." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Around 2 o'clock, a white truck, the kind landscaping crews use, was in front of your house for about 45 minutes, 2 people working in the front garden." I said, "Did you see who?" He said, "I did not go out. I was watching from my window. I could not identify the individuals from that distance." I said, "Did you see what they were doing?" He said, "I assumed they were your landscaping contractors. I know you do some of your own work, but I have seen service trucks here before." I said, "Was Barbara Crane's car anywhere on the street during that time?" Robert said yes, her car was parked in front of her house, which is normal, but he paused. "Around the time the truck arrived, I think I saw her come outside briefly, I am not certain." I said, "Thank you, Robert." He said, "Ellen, I am sorry about the maple. I watched you plant that tree." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "The right things in the right order." I called my attorney that morning. My attorney was a woman named Diana Voss, who handled property and civil matters and who had helped me respond to the second and third of Barbara's notices when the complexity of the HOA process had exceeded what I wanted to navigate alone. Diana listened to everything. She said, "Document, police report, and arborist assessment," in that order. I said, "I have the photographs." She said, "Good, now the police report." I said, "For plant damage." She said, "For the willful destruction of landscape plants on private property, which in this state is criminal damage to property. The value of the damage determines whether it is a misdemeanor or a felony. Your specimen trees have value, Ellen. A mature Japanese maple trained over 4 years and a flowering cherry moved as a bald and burlapped specimen are not nursery stock. They have assessed value." I said, "How do I establish that?" She said, a certified arborist or horticultural appraiser. They assess the value of landscape plants using established methodologies that courts recognize. I said I did not know such assessments existed. She said they do, trunk formula method, replacement cost method, depending on the species and the situation. Your maple is not replaceable because you grew and trained it specifically. The assessed value will reflect what it would cost to achieve an equivalent specimen, which is significant. I said, all right, police first. She said, police first. The officer who came was a deputy named Officer Marcus Webb, who had been on property crime calls before and who took the situation with the seriousness it deserved. He looked at the damage. He looked at my photographs. He wrote the report carefully. He said, do you have a suspect? I said, I have a strong suspicion. He said, tell me. I told him about Barbara, about the 8 notices, about the dismissals, about Robert's account of the truck, about the timing relative to Barbara's car being on the street. He said, that is circumstantial. I said, I know. He said, do you have any direct evidence connecting her to this? I said, not yet. He said, the report will document what you have told me. If additional evidence comes to light, you can update the report. I said, yes. He said, Ms. Park, the arborist assessment you mentioned, get that done quickly. The damage value matters for how seriously this is treated. I said, I know. He said, a lot of people think plant damage is minor. Courts do not always agree when the value is properly established. I said, I will have the assessment done this week. He said, good luck. I called a certified arborist named Thomas Garfield, who had been recommended by Diana as someone with experience in damage assessment. He came Saturday. He spent 2 hours examining the damage, taking measurements, consulting his methodology references, photographing the cut surfaces of the maple and cedar, and the soil evidence of the cherry removal. He called me Monday with a preliminary figure. He said, Ms. Park, I want to prepare you. I said, tell me. He said, the Japanese maple, 4 years of growth from a 5-gallon container to a 12-foot trained specimen. The trunk formula method, which is the standard for trees of this size, gives a value of approximately $14,000. This is based on the species, the size at time of damage, and the trained form, which represents significant added value from the cultivation work. I said, 14,000. He said, for the maple, the flowering cherry moved as a bald and burlapped specimen of the size you described and established over 2 seasons. Replacement cost method gives approximately $4,500. The weeping Atlas cedar cut back to 18 inches of a trained form that represented 3 years of development. Partial damage, value approximately $6,000. I said, what is the total? He said, with the understory damage, which I am estimating at approximately $3,000 for replacement and establishment, $27,500, approximately. I called Diana. I said, the arborist assessment is $27,500. Diana said, Ellen, in this state, criminal damage to property exceeding $25,000 is a Class B felony. I said, I know. The investigation that followed took 6 weeks. I was not the primary driver of it. Detective Clara Henderson, who was assigned when the property damage report was elevated based on the arborist's assessment, was the primary driver. She interviewed Robert Kim. She interviewed 2 other neighbors who had seen activity at my property on that Thursday. She obtained security camera footage from a doorbell camera on a house 3 doors down that had captured a white landscaping truck driving down Westhaven Drive in the direction of my house at 1:47 p.m. on Thursday and leaving at 2:31 p.m. She obtained the registration of the truck. It was registered to a landscaping company called Crane Gardens. Crane Gardens was owned by Barbara Crane's brother. Detective Henderson interviewed Barbara. I was not present for that interview. What I know of it came from Diana, who was kept informed by the detective as the investigation proceeded and who relayed what the detective shared. Barbara had initially denied any knowledge of the landscaping work at my property. When presented with the truck registration, she had said her brother's company occasionally did work in the neighborhood and that she had no knowledge of what they had done at my address. When the detective pointed out that the truck had been on Westhaven Drive for 44 minutes specifically at my address, Barbara had said she could not account for her brother's business activities. The detective interviewed Barbara's brother. His name was Michael Crane, and he was, according to Diana's account of what the detective had told her, not as prepared for the conversation as Barbara had been. Michael Crane told the detective that Barbara had asked him to do some landscape cleanup work at my address. He said she had told him the property owner had requested the work. When the detective asked him to explain why he had not verified the request directly with the property owner, Michael had said Barbara had handled the client communication. When the detective asked him to produce any written or electronic communication from me authorizing the work, Michael had not been able to produce any. Michael Crane was interviewed twice. On the second interview, with an attorney present, he provided a statement that was more complete than the first. He said Barbara had told him the homeowner at my address wanted the Japanese maple and the flowering cherry removed and the Atlas cedar cut back, and that she had arranged it through her role on the HOA landscaping committee. He said he had assumed the HOA authorization was sufficient. There was no HOA authorization. The subcommittee chair did not have authority to authorize work on a homeowner's property. This was explicit in the governing documents. Michael had not verified it. Barbara was arrested on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after my plants were destroyed on a Thursday afternoon. The charge was Class B felony criminal damage to property. The charge was based on the arborist's assessed value of $27,500 and the evidence connecting her to the authorization of the work. Diana called me when she heard. She said, "The arrest has been made." I said, "Good." She said, "Ellen, the criminal case is one piece of this. The civil case is another." I said, "I know." She said, $27,500 in plant damage plus your legal fees through this process. That is a significant civil claim. I said, "Yes." She said, "And there is the HOA dimension." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Barbara used her position as subcommittee chair to direct work on your property without authorization. She abused her HOA position to cause damage to a homeowner's property. The HOA has a governance question to answer about how that was possible." I said, "I want to address the HOA as well." She said, "I thought you would." I said, "But first I want to talk about what comes next in the garden." She said, "The garden." I said, "Yes, I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks, about what I am going to replace the damaged plants with." She said, "You have been planning the replacement garden." I said, "I have been planning the replacement garden, and what I am planning is different from what was there before." She said, "Tell me." I said what was there before was a garden that could be destroyed. Beautiful plants, years of work, significant value, but destroyable. You can cut a tree, you can dig out a root ball, you can cut back a trained form. She said, "And what you are planning?" I said, "Something that cannot be destroyed, something permanent, something that once it is in place is part of the property in a way that no tool can undo without significant structural effort." She said, "What specifically?" I said, "Masonry, stone, hardscape that is an integral part of the property infrastructure, plants within that hardscape that are selected specifically for their resilience and their difficulty of removal, and documentation of everything so that the replacement garden is established as a legal permanent feature of the property." Diana said, "A fortress." I said, "That is the right word." She said, "Ellen, the civil case will fund this." I said, "Yes." She said, "When do you want to start planning?" I said, "I have been planning for 6 weeks. I am ready to start building." End of part 1. Part 2. HOA Karen destroyed my landscaping, so I replaced it with a fortress she could never remove. The design process for the replacement garden took 3 weeks from the day I engaged a landscape architect named Patricia Sung, who had been recommended to me by Thomas Garfield, the arborist, as someone who understood both the horticultural and the structural dimensions of what I was planning. I explained to Patricia what I wanted, not a garden that looked like what I had before, not a replacement of the things that had been destroyed, a different kind of garden entirely, one whose permanence was structural rather than horticultural, one that incorporated hardscape elements that were part of the property's infrastructure, and one that used the specific protections of permanent construction to make the kind of destruction that had happened to my previous garden physically impossible. Patricia understood immediately. She said, "You want something that has the legal protection of a structure." I said, "Yes, plants can be removed without permits, structures cannot." She said, "A garden that is primarily a hardscape installation with plants incorporated into it, rather than a planting that has incidental hardscape elements." I said, "Exactly." She said, "Tell me what you are thinking aesthetically." I described what I had been imagining: a series of raised stone planting walls, dry stacked granite with mortared footings, running along the front slope of my property in terraced layers that followed the natural grade. Each terrace 2 to 3 feet high, the walls substantial enough to require demolition permits to remove, the plants within the terraces selected for permanence and resilience. At the property boundary, a low granite border wall, set in concrete footing, that defined the garden edge in a way that was both aesthetically appropriate for a craftsman bungalow and structurally integral to the property. Patricia took notes, she sketched. She came back the following week with preliminary drawings. The design was better than what I had imagined. She had worked with the slope of the property to create 3 distinct terrace levels, each one retained by a dry stacked granite wall of varying height, between 18 inches and 3 feet. The granite she had specified was a local quarry stone with a warm grey tone that complemented the craftsman exterior of my house. The walls were designed to be aesthetically appropriate for the neighborhood, while being structurally substantial enough that their removal would require a permit and significant labor. At the street boundary, a continuous granite border wall 12 inches tall and 12 inches wide, set on a concrete footing that extended below the frost line, aesthetically modest, structurally permanent. Within the terraced beds, she had specified plants with 3 characteristics. First, established size at planting, meaning specimens that would not look new and fragile, but would look as if they had been there for years. Second, root systems that would integrate with the stone walls over time, making the plants literally part of the structure. Third, species that were legally recognized as established landscape elements with assessed value, so that any damage to them in the future would have immediate and documented dollar consequences. At the back of the upper terrace, in the location where the Japanese maple had stood, she had specified a dwarf Japanese maple of a different variety, one that was naturally compact and would not trigger Barbara's height concerns, planted in a stone alcove that was structurally integral to the upper wall. The stone alcove was designed so that removing the tree would require removing the wall section around it. I looked at Patricia's drawings for a long time. Then I said, "This is right." She said, "The building permit question." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The retaining walls over 30 inches in height require a building permit in this city. The street boundary wall requires a permit as a fence-equivalent structure. The terraces between 18 and 30 inches do not require permits individually, but the overall project, because of the footing work and the gradding, may require a gradding permit." I said, "I want every permit that is applicable." She said, "You want the permits." I said, "I want this project to be on the record with the city in every way that can make it permanent. Permitted structures have legal standing that unpermitted work does not. I want this garden to be a permitted permanent installation." She said, "That adds time to the project." I said, "I know." She said, 3 to 4 weeks for permit approvals. I said, "File them this week." She filed the permit applications. I engaged a contractor named Steve Balcombe who had done masonry work for two neighbors on Westhaven Drive and who had the specific expertise of someone who had been working with stone for 20 years. Steve reviewed Patricia's drawings and said the design was sound and buildable and that he could have his crew on site within 2 weeks of permit approval. While the permits were being processed, the civil case moved forward. Diana filed the civil suit 3 weeks after the criminal arrest. The defendants were Barbara Crane and Michael Crane and Crane Gardens. The claim was for the full arborist assessed value of $27,500 plus legal fees and what Diana described as the consequential costs of the replacement project. The consequential costs included Patricia Sung's design fees, the permit application fees, and a portion of Steve Balcomb's construction estimate that was attributable to the structural features that were required because of the specific vulnerability the destruction had exposed. The total civil claim was $41,000. Kwan, who had represented the HOA in the previous story, was not involved here. Barbara's attorney was a man named Timothy Walsh, who practiced general civil litigation and who called Diana 3 days after the filing. He said his client maintained she had not directed the work at my property, but had simply provided information to her brother about landscaping standards concerns at the address. Diana said her brother's statement to the detective said she told him the homeowner had requested the work and that she had arranged it through her HOA committee role. Walsh said, "My client disputes her brother's characterization." Diana said, "We will see what the court makes of it." Walsh said, "Is your client interested in settlement discussions?" Diana said, "My client is interested in the full amount claimed plus documented costs. Her interest in settlement is contingent on the full amount being acknowledged." Walsh said he would speak to his client. He called back the following week. He said Barbara was prepared to acknowledge the damage and discuss a settlement figure, but was not prepared to accept full liability for the assessed amount. Diana said, "The assessed amount is the assessed amount. It was prepared by a certified arborist using established methodology. We are not negotiating the assessment." Walsh said, "The replacement cost for the trees is arguably lower than the assessed value." Diana said, "The replacement cost does not capture the value of the trained forms and the establishment period. That is why the trunk formula method exists. The assessment is correct." Walsh said he would continue discussions. They continued for 3 weeks. During that time, the permits for the garden project were approved. Steve Balcomb's crew arrived on a Monday morning with stone and equipment and began the footing work for the street boundary wall. I watched the first stones being set from my front window. The footing trench had been dug the previous week. The concrete footing was poured and cured. The first course of granite was going in, each stone carefully fitted to the next, the wall taking shape along my property's street boundary in a way that was permanent in a sense that plants could never be. Barbara's car was parked in front of her house across the street. I do not know if she was watching. I did not look. The civil settlement was reached in the 4th week of negotiation. The final figure was $37,500. Diana had held firm on the arborist assessment and had given ground only on a portion of the consequential costs. Accepting $25,000 of the assessment plus $12,500 in legal fees and project costs, rather than the full consequential cost calculation. She called me when the agreement was signed. She said, $37,500, check within 30 days. I said, what did Barbara say when she signed? Diana said, Timothy Walsh did not share her reaction. I said, did she fight it? She said she fought everything until the last week. The criminal case made the civil settlement more or less inevitable. Once the detective's evidence was in the file and Michael's statement was on record, her attorney knew the trial outcome was not favorable. I said, what is the status of the criminal case? She said, plea discussions are ongoing. The DA has offered a plea to a reduced charge with restitution. Barbara's attorney has been negotiating the terms. I said, what is the restitution amount? She said, the arborist assessment, 27,500, which is already being addressed by the civil settlement. I said, so the criminal plea restitution and the civil settlement overlap. She said, yes, the criminal restitution will be credited against the civil settlement obligation. The net to you does not change. I said, and Barbara? She said she will plead to a reduced charge, likely a misdemeanor given her lack of prior record, with full restitution, probation, and the condition that she have no contact with you or your property. I said, no HOA involvement. She said, the criminal conviction will be on her record. What the HOA does with that is up to them. I said, I am addressing the HOA separately. She said, I know. The letter to the HOA board went out on a Tuesday morning while Steve's crew was installing the second terrace wall. The letter was from Diana on her firm letterhead. It addressed 4 points. First, it documented Barbara's criminal arrest and the pending plea on charges arising from her use of her HOA subcommittee position to direct unauthorized work on my property. Second, it noted that the subcommittee governing documents explicitly prohibited direct action by subcommittee members on homeowner property and that Barbara's conduct had been a clear violation of those documents. Third, it requested a formal HOA response addressing how a subcommittee chair had been permitted to use her position to cause property damage to a homeowner, what governance failures had allowed this, and what reforms the board intended to implement. Fourth, it noted that if the HOA's response was inadequate, we reserved the right to add the HOA as a party to the civil matter on a theory of negligent supervision of a board officer. The HOA board chair, a man named Gregory Marsh, who had been in the position for 2 years and who I had found to be reasonable in my limited interactions with him, called Diana the day after receiving the letter. He said the board was deeply concerned by what had happened and was committed to addressing it. Diana said, we want to hear what that means specifically. He said the board had already asked Barbara to resign from the subcommittee chair position. She had not yet done so. Diana said, we suggest the board make that request more emphatic. Gregory said, we can remove her from the position without her cooperation. We are preparing to do so. Diana said, what else? He said the board was reviewing the subcommittee governing documents to add explicit language about the consequences of unauthorized conduct and a requirement for homeowner consent documentation before any subcommittee recommendation could be acted upon. Diana said, when will that amendment be completed? He said, within 30 days. Diana said, we want a copy. He said he would send it. He said, Ms. Voss, I want to ask about the negligent supervision claim. Diana said, if the governance reform is substantive and implemented promptly, and the board formally acknowledges that Barbara's conduct was enabled by inadequate oversight, we will not pursue the HOA claim. He said, what does formal acknowledgement look like? Diana said, a written communication to all Westhaven Drive homeowners acknowledging what happened, that a subcommittee chair used her position improperly to cause damage to a homeowner's property, and what the board is doing to prevent it happening again. He said, that is a significant public acknowledgement. Diana said, what happened was significant. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I will bring it to the full board. The full board voted to issue the communication at their next meeting. The communication went out to all homeowners on Westhaven Drive and the surrounding blocks. It was 2 paragraphs, and it said what Diana had asked it to say. It was specific about the nature of the conduct and the board's response. I read it when it arrived. I added it to the file. Barbara resigned from the subcommittee chair position the day after the communication went out. I know this because Gregory Marsh sent me a brief note informing me. The note said the board had accepted her resignation and that the subcommittee would be reorganized with revised procedures before a new chair was appointed. The criminal plea was entered 2 weeks after the civil settlement was signed. Barbara pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge, paid the restitution which was credited against the civil settlement, and received 18 months of probation with a no-contact condition covering me and my property. The criminal conviction meant she was no longer eligible to serve on the HOA board in any capacity under the HOA's governing documents, which contained a provision disqualifying anyone with a criminal conviction related to property from board service. This was, in practical terms, the end of Barbara Crane's HOA involvement on Westhaven Drive. I want to tell you about the garden, because the garden is the part of this story that outlasts everything else. Steve Balcomb's crew worked for 4 weeks. The street boundary wall went in first, the 12-inch granite border continuous along my property's street edge, set on its concrete footing. Then the 3 terrace walls, dry stacked with mortared footings, the largest stones at the base, and the courses above fitting together with the specific care of a mason who understood that the appearance of dry stacking required the same precision as mortared work, the stones supporting each other through geometry and weight rather than adhesive. The terraces were filled with a specific soil mix that Patricia had specified, topsoil amended with compost and sand to create the drainage and fertility profile she wanted for the plants she had chosen. The irrigation was installed before the plants went in, a new drip system with better coverage than what I had built before, the lines running through the stone walls through gaps that were integral to the design. The plants went in on a Friday. Patricia had sourced specimen material that was larger than standard nursery stock. The dwarf Japanese maple for the stone alcove was a 7-year-old specimen that had been container-grown and was already showing the branching structure that would develop into the form I had lost. It went into the alcove with its root balls surrounded by the mortared stone on 3 sides, the alcove designed to hold it in a way that made the tree and the wall one installation. The other plants followed the design, each one placed in the terraced beds in the positions Patricia had specified, each one set into the soil against the granite walls that would hold them and over time be held by them as the roots developed. When Patricia and I walked the finished garden on the Monday after planting, I stood at the street and looked at what had been done. The stone walls rose in 3 terraces up the slope of my property. The granite was warm grey in the morning light, the dry stacked surface textured in a way that looked as if it had been there for a long time, which was the intention. The plants were placed within the walls in a way that made the whole composition feel integrated, as if the stones had grown up around the plants rather than the plants having been added to the stones. The street boundary wall ran the full width of my property, low and continuous, the granite solid and permanent. Anyone looking at it understood that it was not something you moved or removed without significant effort. Patricia said, "It is good work." I said, "It is the right thing." She said, "The permits are in the city record, the construction is documented, every structural element is on file." I said, "Yes." She said, "No one touches this without a permit." I said, "No one touches this without a permit." Robert Kim came over that afternoon. He stood at the street and looked at the new garden for a while. He said, "Ellen, this is something." I said, "Yes." He said, "It looks like it has always been here." I said, "Good." He said, "The Japanese maple in the stone alcove." I said, "7-year-old specimen." He said, "It is going to be extraordinary in 20 years." I said, "Yes." He said, "The walls." I said, "Granite, on concrete footings below the frost line." He said, "Nobody is touching those." I said, "No." He said, "Ellen, I watched what happened to your first garden. I am glad this is here." I said, "Robert, so am I." He went back across the street. I stayed in the garden for a while, which I had not been able to do since October when I had stood in the dusk looking at what had been taken. I walked the terraces and looked at each plant in its stone setting and thought about the 4 years I had spent on what was gone and the months I had spent planning what was here. What was gone had been beautiful. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Japanese maple I had grown from a 5-gallon container to a 12-foot canopy, the trained cedar, the established flowering cherry, those things had represented years of work and care and the specific relationship that develops between a gardener and the living things they tend. Losing them had been a genuine loss, and no amount of legal process or settlement checks changed that. What replaced them was different, not better than what I had lost, not in the sense of the plants themselves, but better in a different sense, more permanent, more considered, built with the knowledge of what could happen and the intention to make it not happen again, built in a way that said this is here, and it is here correctly, and the record shows it, and the stone says it, and no committee chair with a landscaping grudge and a brother with a truck is going to change that. I want to tell you one more thing, a small thing that happened 6 months after the garden was finished. I came home from work on a Thursday evening, which is still the day I worked the late shift, and as I turned onto Westhaven Drive, I saw that Barbara Crane's house was for sale. A sign in front, the standard real estate sign with the agent's number and the small insert that said coming soon. I parked in my driveway, I got out, I looked at the sign for a moment, then I looked at my garden. The stone walls in the early evening light, the Japanese maple in its alcove, showing its first year of growth in the new location, the branching already beginning to develop the form that would take years to fully realize. The terraced beds with their plantings settling into the soil, the roots finding the spaces between the stones, the slow process of integration that would over years make the garden and the structure one thing. I went inside, I made dinner, I sat at my kitchen table and ate and thought about nothing in particular. The garden was visible through my front window in the last of the day's light, the granite holding its warmth from the afternoon sun. Barbara Crane's house sold 8 weeks later. I do not know where she went, I did not ask. The garden is still here, the permits are on file, the documentation is current. The stone does not move.